Hi, welcome to week 2 of Environmental Science, ENVI 211. We're going to be talking this week about ecosystems, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. And hopefully you are also seeing my computer screen, which has a PowerPoint displayed on it. And I'm going to just run through some quick concepts I want to make sure I highlight that are important to understanding this material. We're working through the fundamentals of environmental science right now. So these first few weeks are going to be really important to understanding some of the environmental problems and some of the benefits that our environment provides for us in the weeks to come in this class. So I want to make sure that everybody understands fully what an ecosystem is. What is an ecosystem? It is a system through which life is sustained by many organisms, all of them interacting with each other, and their physical and chemical environments. So it's the whole shebang. When you look at an environment, say the boreal forest, all covered with snow right now, here in Alaska, you're looking at a whole bunch of different living things, all of them interacting with each other. Some of them are eating each other, some of them are competing with each other, some of them are necessary for the survival of each other, and your book talks about that to some degree. So be sure you understand all the different names for the types of interactions that organisms can undertake. And then the things that support those different organisms. So we call them abiotic factors, but they're basically the physical and chemical place that these organisms live. And so ecosystems are really sort of the mechanism through which life on Earth is sustained. And in case that isn't all confusing, I'll refer you back to The Lion King, which is a great example of an ecosystem and sort of the whole food web unveiled, which is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. But the concept that everything is interrelated, everything is interacting, and all life depends on all other life out there in our ecosystems. So ecosystem characteristics, ecosystems all have structure. They also have processes that are going on in each ecosystem. So by structure, I mean all the living and non-living parts, and by processes, I mean both chemical cycling, nutrient cycling, and energy flow. And the structure is created by how these processes take place in the ecosystem, but it also dictates how these processes take place. So, as I said, everything is interacting. By living structure, I'm mostly referring to food webs. And food webs are essentially how organisms transfer energy, chemical elements, and compounds to each other, basically by eating each other or eating parts of each other. So a food web is really a model of who eats who, and I want to make sure that everybody understands the concept of the trophic level, because that's incredibly important in understanding how energy flows through an ecosystem. So, of course, in any ecosystem, the basis of the energy is sunlight, right? Sun comes in, and primary producers use that sunlight to create biomass or tissue, and then other things in that ecosystem that are involved in that food web eat those primary producers, those plants, and gain that energy. So it's important to understand how that energy is transferred throughout a food web and throughout those different trophic levels. Now, food webs can be fairly complex, and it can be hard to tell which and how many organisms are involved. It can also be difficult to suss out who is eating who, because organisms eat many different kinds of prey. And then, of course, they feed at more than one trophic level. Again, trophic levels are the number of levels away from the sunlight that an organism typically eats at. And then, of course, predators may also eat prey and compete with prey at some level. So this diagram shows you sort of a stylized vision of a relatively simple marine terrestrial food web. So this would be a coastal food web that has some members in the water and some members on the shore. And this would be typical of some of our islands, potentially, or nearshore coastal areas, say down in Prince William Sound. And I'd ask all of you to take a minute and see how many trophic levels you can find in this image. You can even pause this presentation if you want to take a little bit longer to check this out. But I'm going to move on and say that the answer to the question is written down in the notes section of this slide, so you can use that to kind of hone your trophic level assessment skills and think about how many different levels away from the sun as the primary source of energy in this food web this diagram represents. And I'll let you read down below, but basically there's 5 trophic levels represented here, although you could argue that some species represented here actually represent more than just one trophic level. So the energy flow through ecosystems is a very important concept to think about because it's how we as humans, which are usually at the top of the trophic level, how we get our energy. And it's through this process of energy flow through ecosystems, also known as trophic transfer. However, ecosystem energy flow is governed by 2 laws of thermodynamics, which you should be very familiar with by the time this class is over. The first law is that energy is neither created nor destroyed, so that's the law of conservation of energy. So in our whole global universe, the energy level at one point in time is the same as the energy level at any other point in time. So that might give you the idea that energy is cycled in our environment. That is not true because no use of energy is ever 100% efficient. And that is the second law of thermodynamics, which is incredibly important because it means that through any given ecosystem, as one trophic level eats a previous trophic level, that consumption of energy that's transferred through those trophic levels is never 100% efficient. And in fact, it's far less than 100% efficient. It's like 99% inefficient. So most of our energy from the sun in any ecosystem always is lost as heat. And where does that heat go? It escapes out into the atmosphere and then eventually into outer space, of course. You can see by looking in the notes section how inefficient energy transfer can be by reading through some of the bullet points as far as the conversion of the sun's energy into tissue at another trophic level. Okay, so moving on past energy flow, and you should have read a lot more about energy flow through ecosystems in your book. I'm going to switch to the other topic this week, which is basically biogeochemistry. So this, in contrast to energy flow, is a much more cyclical process, and that's why we also call biogeochemistry nutrient cycling. So in contrast to energy, which always escapes as heat at every step of a food web, biogeochemistry, or nutrient cycling, happens within food webs, but also between food webs and living organisms and their abiotic environment. And there are parts of each ecosystem that are known as pools of these nutrients, and that's where a nutrient can reside for a period of time. And then there are other places where that nutrient is considered in flux, and so it's moving between one pool and another pool. So this slide here shows you some of the words, the terms that I want you guys to know from this biogeochemistry or nutrient cycling section. So I want you to understand the difference between micronutrient and macronutrient. Macronutrients are things that are in large supply in our environment, such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those are the big ones that I want you guys to know. And then micronutrients are things that are in much smaller concentration, but are still just as important to cycle because they're important for life. And those might be things like magnesium and calcium and other minerals that we refer to as vitamins or nutrients, and we take a multivitamin to get those sometimes because we don't get enough from our diet. So those things also cycle in our environment, but with much less concentration than macronutrients. A limiting factor, I am not going to define for you right now, but I want you to know that term, so you're going to need to know that for your discussion board post. So be thinking about what a limiting factor is. And then the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere are all terms that refer to places where nutrients can reside. So basically, those pools. For an individual cycle, I want you to be able to know or understand which places are pools and which places are fluxes. not so much places or fluxes, but what processes create a movement from one pool to another pool, which we call a flux. Residence time is the amount of time that any nutrient stays in a given pool before it's moved out of that pool. And then source versus sink isn't so much one term as it is a way to get you guys thinking about what fluxes, what processes create a abundance of a particular nutrient, and what processes create a place where that nutrient is taken into a pool. And then last but not least, any guesses what this picture shows? I'm going to tell you because I deleted the next slide that has it on it, but it is a phytoplankton bloom out in the ocean taken from a satellite image. It's quite a pretty image if you think about it. Okay, I am going to go now briefly through the three big cycles that I want you guys to know and just point out some important things to think about in each of these cycles. So the first one is the carbon cycle. Obviously, it is the nutrient carbon cycling around between the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, and then the ocean here. And the processes by which this nutrient is cycled are described on this slide and also in your book. But basically all of these things here in smaller wording are generally the fluxes through which the element is moved through these different pools. And so there's some natural places where carbon can be moved, and then there's some places where humans also influence the movement of carbon. The nitrogen cycle is quite different in that it has very few ways in which nitrogen can be removed from the atmosphere and brought into the biosphere or the lithosphere. And basically, that process is called fixation, nitrogen fixation, and that can be done through two mechanisms, through lightning and through bacterial fixation. Maybe some of you are aware of root nodules on plants. Those root nodules have little bacteria in them that actually fix nitrogen. So that's the only two ways we can get nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Then that nitrogen cycles around in our soil, and the only way we can get it back into the atmosphere is through the process of denitrification, which is where breakdown, decomposition of plant material, for the most part, allows nitrogen to escape back into the atmosphere. And of course, humans have a role to play in this as well, in that fossil fuel emissions do release nitrates into the atmosphere, which can then be added to that nitrogen pool. And lastly, the phosphorus cycle. This cycle happens much more slowly than the other two cycles. The biggest sort of thing to take home here is that A, it is slow, as I just said, and that B, it's very difficult to move phosphorus from the marine pool or the ocean pool into the soil and have it be uptaken by animals and plants and back into the atmosphere. So what often happens is that phosphorus ends up in the ocean through the process of runoff and incorporation into animals, which eventually end up in the sea. That gets incorporated into marine sediments. And then the only way really to get that back up to the surface of the earth is through some kind of geological upheaval. The only other way that can happen is through seabirds bringing guano from marine environment onto shore where they nest, and they leave that guano, which is basically bird poop, and that allows phosphorus to get transferred onto terrestrial environments. So these cycles probably feel a little bit like there's never going to be enough nitrogen and phosphorus in particular. And what I want to stress is that humans have figured out ways to either create excess nitrogen or mine excess phosphorus. In the case of carbon, we've figured out ways in which we can use the energy from carbon, such as fossil fuels, and then that excess carbon is released to the atmosphere through the process of burning fossil fuels, and so it's carbon dioxide that's released. So even though nutrients can be in limiting supply, particularly carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, The reality is that humans have changed many of these cycles to actually produce more than enough for our needs. And so what we end up having is too much of a good thing, which is a process that we refer to in many cases as eutrophication. And this is a process through which, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, when they're in too much abundance in a system, in your discussion board reading we'll talk about how that can happen, these nutrients remove a limitation from the growth of phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are these little green organisms that are basically primary producers in aquatic environments, either freshwater or saltwater. And they require sunlight to make food to basically be able to photosynthesize and grow bigger. They also require nitrogen and phosphorus as nutrients, building blocks for their cellular material. So when you have too much nitrogen and phosphorus in an aquatic environment, it removes that limit on growth of phytoplankton, and you can get, as long as you have sunlight, you can get a huge bloom of these phytoplankton, and it's also known as an algae bloom, which is what we've seen right here. And you might think, well, that's why there's so little oxygen in places where there's algae blooms, because the algae are eating all the oxygen up. Well, that's not quite true, because in the process of photosynthesis, oxygen is actually a byproduct. So the algae themselves can sometimes add oxygen to the water during the day, although they do use it at night when they're not photosynthesizing and just respiring. The big issue happens when that algae bloom, some of the organisms in that algae bloom start to get old, they start to die, and then they decay, and those decomposing bacteria here are the ones that actually use up a lot of the oxygen. So what you have is a massive algae bloom if you have too much nitrogen and phosphorus. You have that algae using up a lot of the oxygen at night and then dying, and the decomposition process using up a lot of the oxygen both at night and during the day, and you get a low oxygen environment. And that can be really bad for other things that live in that aquatic environment. And go back to this slide here. This is kind of a stylized diagram of a ecosystem. And I'm going to end the recording here, but I want you guys to all take a look at this image just briefly and basically ask yourself, here's an ecosystem that's got both energy and nutrient cycling going on. What are some of the sources and uses of energy in this ecosystem? Where in the diagram is a food web shown? Which component in that food web is the primary producer and which is the top consumer? I want to make sure everybody understands how energy flows through a system and what are the producers and what are the consumers. What is one way that nutrients, marine-derived nutrients, and nutrients from the ocean are made available to the terrestrial environment in this picture? And then what is one way that marine nutrients are removed from the system? I'm going to give everyone just a minute to think about that. And then I'm going to end this recording and hope that you learned something from this and that this made some of the points from the book a little bit more clear. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you.